Okay. It's 12:05, ladies and gentlemen, so I'm going to get us started. Robert and I, if you just came in, Robert and I, as per usual, just sort of shooting the breeze for a few minutes while everybody came in. But let's get started. This is our second meeting of the TELCoP for 2024. We're doing something a bit different this year. We're doing more of a sort of a discussion and a bit of a talk about some topics. And what Robert and I are trying to do to start the year is pick things that we think are sort of hot topics, significant issues in higher education and technology enhanced learning. And so Robert did the first one in March, and we've decided that I'm gonna do this one in May. And the idea is that we should start ourselves. If we want to talk about these hot topics, we should probably start ourselves. And so I don't know. Do you want to do the sort of the delivery, Robert? Since it's me, I will hand over to Robert to do the actual talking about it.
Yeah.
How about that?
I'll explain it, but because you normally do the introduction. One of the first things that we've decided to do is in the last 2 years, we kind of have been doing. We have our common Daryl education. One during the year where Daryl comes in and just blows our mind with the most amazing stuff, and he seems to be able to do that year after year. But around the Daryl education, we also have attended the last 2 years about doing these interviews and speakers coming in. And one of the dilemmas that you do that for so many years, it's harder to bring new and fresh people in. So what we're trying to do this year, in the middle of just continually bringing speakers in, is really bringing up a sense of academic conversation where we want to be able to have some issues and be able to talk about these issues, but in a safe space where we know that we're, not always is everybody saying exactly what they feel, as much as having an academic discourse about presenting different points of view and allowing us to start to be able to generate a space to just have academic conversations where we share ideas. But we realize people have roles and positions outside of academic conversation, so we don't tie them to them. We let them have a space here and have kind of a safety. And what we did was, we obviously don't want to bring anybody in to speak in that place unless we do it first, because it can be uncomfortable that you're worried that if you say anything, because we think that our movement forward in academia needs to be revolved around the ability just to sometimes talk about things in order to move forward. And so last time I talked about the concept of academic integrity, or the concept of cheating, and what does that look like, and what is it going to look like now in the future, in the next 3 weeks, and with the changes that are going on. And Michael is looking to kind of talk about this notion of the third space in the ivory tower. And one of the reasons this topic was kind of chosen is our ties to Askellite. We're both on the exec board. Michael is actually the president of Askellite. And one of the things that we are observing is at not just any one particular institution, all institutions, our third space people that are trying to be involved in Askellite, getting a lot of squeezing and pressure on, well, is this academic? Is this your job? Is this your role? And we've been observing these kind of changes. And so Michael thought this would be a good space for him to speak on as the president of Askellite, who's been interacting even more so with all these individuals and their experiences across multiple universities, not particular at CQ. But the joy is that anybody here at CQ interested that has a perspective could share, whether it's we are part of the whole, or we see something different here. Because obviously both Michael and I are not in third space positions at CQU. But with that, I'll kind of turn it over to Michael to kind of start speaking about his perspective and his view. And I'll kind of be like, if people choose to put questions in their topics, because I'll monitor the chats with questions, with the notion, though, that you could also just chat or ask questions if you wanted to. So yeah, but I'll hand it over to Michael.
Thank you. there's a couple of bits and pieces in here that we usually do. Just for completeness sake, I always acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we're meeting on. I always say to you guys where I am, and you know by now that I'm on a Gumbear land on the Gold Coast, and happy for you to type in the chat where you are as well. But yeah, I wanted to acknowledge traditional custodians, past, present, and emerging of those lands. The other thing that's on these slides, just in terms of sort of catching you up, is the usual stuff about the TELCoP, which you probably don't need to read because you read it last time, but this is what the TELCoP is and what it does. And then a reminder, which I always do, that the TELCoP sessions are on YouTube. For this year, I am just sending them internally. They're on the YouTube, but they are unlisted. I sent out Roberts just to people that came to the that come to the TELCoP. I'm not making them publicly available, and I'll probably do that the same this year. I just want you to feel like, as Robert said, that this is a safe space and that you don't that I'm not sharing it publicly out there in the world. But if Daryl does us a workshop at the middle of the year that's maybe a little less controversial, then that'll probably end up on the TELCoP page. And of course, as Robert said, there is over 2 years of previous TELCoP presentations there as well, which you might find useful. This is me, just in case you don't know me. I'm an associate professor of ICT at CQU, and as Robert said, my big claim to fame this year is that I'm also the president of ASCOLITE. ASCOLITE is the Australasian Society for Computing in Learning in Tertiary Education. They make you learn what it stands for when you become president. It's a requirement, and it's probably the premier sort of technology-enhanced learning society in Australasia. Robert is here as well. He's a senior lecturer at the School of Education and the Arts here at CQU. And he does mention it, but he's also, well, he did mention it, he's an executive committee member of ASCOLITE. He runs a couple of different portfolios. Probably the main one is the special interest groups, of which ASCOLITE has 7. And I'll mention one of the special interest groups to you in a minute. And then the other person that's here, who you might have heard Robert mention just before, is Daryl. Daryl is, and I need that updated photo, Daryl. He's lost a bit of weight since I took that photo. Since he took that photo, so I'll have to get an updated photo of you in the CQU shirt, Daryl. But Daryl really is our practical guy. He has a reputation for working on 3D printing and virtual reality, and very much building interventions for various different schools. For a couple of years, Daryl was on secondment to ITD, building various interventions in innovative tech, I guess would be the way you would describe it. He's now back in the School of Medical and Applied, so Health, Medical and Applied Sciences, doing paramedic training, but continuing to do fancy schmancy innovative tech in his paramedic training. I see all the stuff that he posts on YouTube, not YouTube, Facebook. And I think Daryl really kind of serves as our guy, as Robert said, to do the various different workshops and sort of, dazzle you all with some stuff that he's learnt about innovative tech year on year. Last year, he did using AI to generate art. Previously, he's talked about 3D printing. Previously, he's talked about VR. So we might get another Daryl workshop in the middle of the year. We'll see how things are going. And then here's where the blah blah about me is. Insert glowing Robert-led bio here. I feel like we already did that, right? He's already given, yeah. And then this photo here of us at the last ASCOLITE conference. So they had this one in here last time because it has Robert in it. But this is actually us all posing together, all the executive members at the ASCOLITE 2023 conference in Christchurch. The 2024 conference, ladies and gentlemen, is in Melbourne. You should come along to the conference in Melbourne. We'd love to see you there. The call for papers is now out. The papers are due sort of June, July-ish. There you go. There's my plug. But what I want to talk to you about today, now I've got through those slides, is this thing, right? Working in the third space. And this has been a discussion for a while. And as Robert said, in particular, ASCOLITE has been talking about this for a while because we are getting progressively more and more professional staff members who are in this third space. So what do we mean when we say the third space? Well, this guy here, who I put on the slide, his name's Colin Simpson. He's a real advocate for people in this space. He runs a special interest group for Ascolite called the TELadvisors SIG, and you can see the link down the bottom there. TEL is Technology Enhanced Learning, the TELadvisors SIG. And the TELadvisors advocates for this third space. And so Colin very much says there is this additional space. There is this additional space of people that are not academics, that are not professional staff, but maybe fit somewhere in the middle, right? And typically it is people that are, and he lists them here in this tweet that he put out just last week, learning designers, academic developers, educational technologists, right? The central learning and teaching unit of an organization usually, right? But they could be, I guess you could have these people that are in faculties or schools as well. And they're kind of positioned as a little bit of both, a little bit academic and a little bit professional as well. But they're differently treated depending on the institution you go to. Sometimes they're treated as academic staff members. Sometimes they're treated as professional staff members. It seems to depend on the institution you're going to. And that makes a difference in terms of the kinds of jobs that they get to do. And so Colin asked this on LinkedIn actually 5 days ago, right? And I went, oh, good timing, Colin. He said, a few times recently, I've read comments from academics that don't like the term third space or agree with the idea. Professional staff seem okay with it. And he says, academics, why? And he got lots of responses. You'll see he got 36 comments. And so if you go and look Colin up on LinkedIn, you can read all of the comments that people wrote. This is what I wrote. Oh, and I didn't press see more when I took the picture. Sorry, I'm missing the end, but you get the feel for it. I wrote, honestly, I think a good third space staff member being an expert in the area is basically just an academic with a slightly different set of responsibilities. They do research or scholarship, learning about their space, and teaching, helping the academics to implement it. So not teaching the students, but teaching us as academics. So just let's just call them academics and expand the definition. And Colin came back and said, others have suggested that not going through the traditional academic rite of passage may lead some to have issues with that. And he's right. And when you read the rest of the comments, there's a few people that comment that this idea of a third space academic is controversial in some ways. And so I wanted to kind of raise this as something to talk about and something to discuss. And it's not the first time I've raised it. When Robert and I suggested this is something I was going to talk about, I went and I Googled it and I found this article that I wrote for the Higher Education Digest 2 years ago, where I said, and you can read, I think the heading's pretty clear, right? Forget about the third space. It's time we recognize teaching and learning support as a scholarly activity. It's the same argument I made to Colin last week, the exact same argument. We should treat these people as academics. If you read this article, though, it's a little bit different because I wrote it with Kwong Yui. And Kwong Yui's argument does have that sort of flavor of, well, can we really treat third space people as academics if they're not in the real classroom? And so it's a little bit colored, it's a little bit different. And so I wanted to kind of raise it, and I'm actually going to turn the slides off because I think we can have the discussion a little bit. Where's stop share? There we go. I think my opinion is pretty clear, right? But I'd be very interested in what other people think and have a little bit of a discussion about this with you. And it may be that you think those roles shouldn't exist. It may be that you think they should all be professional staff. It may be that you think that central learning and teaching shouldn't exist. And I do notice a couple of people in the room that are in central learning and teaching. So I'd be interested in their thoughts as well. But first, let's start with Dr. Robert.
So I wanted to share my point of view prior to the
Yep.
conversation so that nobody mishears anything I say. So I worked at 3 different universities in America prior to moving to Australia. I've been only working at CQU for 8 years. However, I've been very involved, with Ascolite with many different universities in Australia. And with my experience at the 3 different universities I worked in America, we did not have a third space. What ends up happening is, you are 100% in control of your curriculum, and you define your own Moodle if the Moodle is there. I was working pre-Moodle when there was no Moodle. You just went to your classes and you hand out a piece of paper with a syllabus, right? And you had books and everything. So I sometimes don't even know how to define a third space, right? Because we don't really have a teaching and learning. Like, we show up and we always get like one training at the beginning of the year, at the very first thing, and then you never have anything again. No one ever consults you with helping you with your class. You just don't have anywhere to go. Now, I do know there are universities that have like a person that oversees teaching and learning for the whole university, but they don't have staff or anybody down. There's no rollover. Nobody rolls over. You do everything on your own. All the stuff you do is on your own. So sometimes I misspeak and misunderstand. So I just want to let everybody know that so that it doesn't come across weird, because I sometimes struggle with even how do we define the third space coming from a place where everything is designed differently. So I just want to give you that heads up before we start so that my perspective.
What do you think? Do you think should we have third space? I'm not putting you on the spot. That's okay. I'm allowed to put you on the spot, right? Should we have third space staff?
I haven't come to a full realization of that, right? Because my very first job teaching was at University of California, Riverside. I taught educational psychology, and they basically just threw me in the classroom, said, what textbook do you want to use? You pick the textbook. You'll decide how many tests there are and how many quizzes there are, whatever you want to do. And then, we give you a TA. And I had a teaching, I never had a teaching assistant. And so that person was my TA. He was a grad student, and he graded everything. And that was the deal, and I developed everything. And then I moved to another university, and I showed up in that university, and the professor, my dean, was like, okay, you're going to teach ed psych, but I want you to design 2 other classes that we want added. And I designed all the curriculum for those classes. I decided all the quizzes for those classes. I put everything into those classes. You know what I mean? So, and then and then when I came here, right, and I moved here, one of the struggles I had was like, oh, somebody's going to design your Moodle. I'm like, what? What does that even mean? Because like, I built master's programs in a Moodle, design my class. So they just designed the Moodle for my class, but then I didn't like it. So I ended up changing it all anyways, right? Because when you come from a background where you have all the control, right, you don't know how to let somebody do something. So every time, I teach a new unit here, I find that they give it to me one way, and I just end up redoing a lot of the work anyways, because the way I run it might be different. Like, one of the things I struggle with our current new Moodle system is how they want to put a way for students to communicate every week or everywhere. And so I have to eliminate all those because I just want one chat place so students don't get fragmented out. And then you have 30 conversations and none of them are talking to each other. So I don't know fully what all the things are done that are done. I've been involved at CQ with the awards and the grants things and seen people run that. However, back in the States, a faculty member would run that as part of their volunteer, and there wouldn't be a third person staff supporting you. We had an internal grant at the university. I won the internal awards, so I was working with that there, and there wasn't a third space person supporting you. You just managed it and oversaw it as part of your giving to the university with your extra time. And that was the way it seemed.
So there were 2 spaces. There's an academic and a professional space, and there's a really big wall between. We were very clear on academics versus professional staff.
I had never met a professional staff at my previous universities that weren't a form of EA.
Yeah, admin person. Yeah, an admin person.
I mean, there wasn't anybody like if we had trainings, they always hired a consultant that came in. There was nobody on campus that trained anybody on anything. You know what I mean? You would work with other faculty, and it was deemed your job of like your individual dean's job was to educate you on getting grants or educate you on research or educate. That was within your dean's purview, not like a third entity. Our only third entity was grants, getting grants and accreditation. You know, the people that came down and said what you have to follow, because same as here, you have internal accreditation for each department area and then an external accreditation.
Yeah, yeah, but even those people you've mentioned to me in the past were more administrative. They knew the deadlines.
Yeah.
They knew what you were allowed to ask for money for, those kinds of things.
My to sound kind or different, my first time coming here, right? I just come here. My PhD is in educational psychology, and in the field of education, we're considered the teaching and learning people, right? Like EdPsych is usually the teaching and learning people, right? Where other people, the curriculum people in education, other people, the assessment people, others, the admin people, in the field of education, I'm the teaching and learning person. So I come in and I meet, and then the person's like, yeah, so what you're really, well, I'm the teaching and learning person. Like, that's awesome. So what's your PhD in? And they're like, I don't have a PhD. I'm like, oh, I didn't know how to grapple. So I said, is your master's in teaching and EdPsych or no? And I was like, oh. And so it was a really unique conversation for me because I was like, so like, how do you get a teaching and learning role if you're not trained in teaching and learning? And then that's where I learned, like, they were more trained in this new definition of a third space, which was never existing, like managing and I call it not the teaching and learning, but managing the education process, not the teaching and learning process. Like students' grades going from one unit to a next unit, that's the education process. Overseeing the look, say, of a unit, that's the education process. Not from my perspective, because like learning is separate from education, and you're trying to apply learning theories in a classroom and make a classroom a learning environment. But learning theories aren't researched in classroom, right? They're researched on how humans learn. And educational theories are researched on applying learning theories in a classroom setting, right? Because not all learning theories work, right, in a classroom setting, because there's 30, 40, 200, 150 people, right? And so these become interesting constructs to make. Sarah Jane.
Yeah, I've heard it referred to as education practice. So we can go to Sarah Jane, or I was also going to go to Daryl and ask him his thoughts, but we can start with Sarah Jane. Do you want to do that one, Robert?
Yes.
It's this interesting space. Academics have this, I think it's this rite of passage that a PhD gives you, this perception that because you've done those hard yards, that makes you a better educator. Some of the best educators I know are in the third space and are definitely not people with letters after their name. And it's this value proposition of not understanding, like Robert was saying, when you come from that academic frame, I don't understand how to value what you contribute to me until you learn what those people do and how they contribute and how amazing the difference they make is in educational journey. And I think it's this understanding perspective of what the third space people bring to the table.
So it sounds like you're an I'm going to sound terrible. You're an academic, Sarah Jane, right? That's almost like I'm endorsing what you just said.
Yes.
But it sounds like you very much value the third space. Tell us a bit about.
Yeah, so I'm an academic, yes, been an academic my whole career, but I only got my PhD 2 years ago. So up until that time, I was considered, because I did a hardcore science faculty, that I was a fake academic because I didn't hold a PhD. Long story, did have a master's, Robert. But because of that, colleagues wouldn't collaborate with you. And so then you look for where are the people who are willing to work with you to help students on their educational journey. And the answer is, it is professional developers. It is people working in those collaborative spaces that are supporting those processes.
To share like a academic perspective, right? Because my PhD, I spent like there's a lot of big differences from country to country. So one of my big differences is we have to take a lot of courses to get our PhD, where in this country, you don't have to take a lot of courses, right? So I took a whole stream of courses in Ed Mid, right? And so, which when you take stream, you look at the history of educational theory, the history of education. Why do we have systems the way we do? You're like looking about how this thing is managed. And so I always talk about this in that, and anybody in the teaching and learning field, when you mix these two, we talk about this together. Teachers are taught how to teach. Academics, tertiary education, secondary education, they're taught to be expertise in a content knowledge. They're not taught how to teach. They never take a unit in it.
Yep.
So what happens is when you go through this whatever period of time, 3 to 5 years, to become an expert in your domain, it becomes very hard to come out and then somebody says, hey, I'm going to teach you how to teach what you're an expert at. And then their thought is, yeah, but I'm the expert. What are you going to teach me how to teach what I'm an expert in? So like, I've been recently working with a faculty member, because I work with faculty members outside of my domain all the time. So I'm working with a faculty member in discrete maths, right? And if you were trying to tell him how to teach discrete maths, his response would be, but do you understand discrete maths? Like he would go, how are you going to help me teach something you don't even understand what it is? And then you're going to say, well, you could do it this way and it would present better. And he would go, yeah, but that's not the way discrete math works. You're not understanding the discrete math. And that's always where the academics meet problems. Now, the other side where academics meet problems is we like to think when we teach in a high school level, we're teaching an idea that maybe this is a truth. But in an academic realm, you realize you're in camps that disagree with each other. And so what happens is you're defending your stance in your content area of what you believe then versus somebody else who, example, when I do structural equation modeling, there's two camps. One camp say these are the indices that show successful structural equation modeling success. And another camp says these are the indices. And so what indices you use and what journals you publish in depends on what camps you're in, because some journals only support one camp and some journals only support another camp. And that's just in your field. So what happens is you're in this field battle, and then all of a sudden somebody shows up from the teaching and learning world and says, hey, let me give you another thing that might disagree with you, like how this is. So that's what I've always seen when I moved here, right? What I found was part of the dilemma is how does somebody because in teaching and learning, in curriculum theory, right? In curriculum theory, there's mainly two camps, right? Content camps and pedagogy camps. And if you're a content camp that says it's really important, and that's where all the standardized testing that's going on with teachers now, that's where that came from, was a content thing. It says, well, we don't really care if teachers know how to teach, because if they don't know the content, it doesn't matter how good of a teacher they are. And so all of a sudden we started testing teachers on, do they have the right content knowledge? And you have, in America, you have to actually have, in Australia, the land type, but in there you have the Praxis 1, which is that. And then there's a Praxis 2, content knowledge in your specific field, that's even more specific, because there was a time period where that camp took over and said, it's not about teaching. It's actually about, do you know the content of what to teach? And I see that ebb and flow go on, right? Historically in education. And I do think CQ, or not CQ, but Australia, right, is having that ebb and flow. If you have a whole third space that's focusing on the teaching and learning, and then you have this other space that says, well, we focus on content, and my PhD gives me an expert in this content area.
Yeah, the academic expertise about the content, but also that academic expertise about the content generates a certain level of academic arrogance about being taught the teaching stuff, if we can divide those things. I want to ask Daryl about his experience, but I'm going to ask Sarah Jane very quickly. You're a new staff member, Sarah Jane. This is totally unfair, but I'm going to do it anyway. What's your idealistic view? Obviously, I mean, Michael's idealistic view, and maybe Robert's, is that the central learning and teaching shouldn't exist as much. Is your idealistic view that they really have a space in the university?
Absolutely. And there's different models of where they should sit. I was really lucky at Griffith that we had, within sciences, we had our own blended learning team, which was a combination of curriculum developers and advisors and technical support and really, and they weren't necessarily, they didn't do all the grunt work, but they supported academics in that dialogue. So I think you've got to have that understanding. So both the content and the pedagogy are important. They both matter. It's not better than that. And the strength in a team where you bring together experts in both. Because I've seen some woeful professors deliver content like they were delivered content 50 years ago, and audiences and it's not great for anybody, actually. And I would agree with Robert that you don't need to have content knowledge to have good pedagogy and to understand how to support a content knowledge expert to actually deliver it. And so I think funding is a problem. So the more funding that you've got, you know, if you've got a very small number of people, then you really can only do it in a central model. And it needs to be there. It needs to be there. No question. And then it's about strategic priorities. So CQU is really good because they require their staff to get some of those knowledges. We have a central unit, right? Rather than associated with all the colleges, but that's okay in a design where there's an expectation that all academics will develop their curriculum, pedagogy, knowledge and skills through specific training, like what Robert did in his PhD. So I guess it depends on individual context, but they absolutely need to be there.
Interesting. Very good diplomatic answer. I like it. Thank you. No, that's good. No, I'm teasing you a little bit. That's okay. So Daryl, the reason I keep on talking about you is I feel like you jump backwards and forwards. You're a paramedic by trade, right? Long career as a paramedic. Moved across to ITD, but not learning and teaching. Then came back to paramedicine again. But I think of almost learning and teaching guy in paramedicine, which is interesting. What's your thoughts, Daryl? Is there a space for a third space? Is the third space totally misrepresented? What do you think it looks like? Oh, we can't hear you. We can't. Yeah, that's weird. Why?
You're not muted, but your microphone isn't working.
Yeah.
It's all these high techies who want to do neat nude versions. Nope, no hearing you. You're probably got to actually turn the microphone on Zoom on the bottom down.
Yeah.
There we go. We got you. Yeah, we got you now. Go
which is from Teams to Zoom. Yeah, I find it a bit of a hard one to answer, really. I guess I tend to sit a bit more in that third space, as you would say, more than anything. I flip between sort of colleges in our own school and across schools a bit too. I've done a little bit of work with nursing recently, in, I guess, better ways to get information across and out there. So I think my skills lie in that area. I'm going down the more academic route. I'm just about through my master's and then hopefully starting to go down the road of a PhD. But I think every lecturer needs to have the ability to fend for themselves. And I think I see in our unit times, a lot of lecturers just have a sort of a hard and fast demarcation between this is my part of the job and this is somebody else's part of the job, like getting the Moodle shells ready and all that sort of stuff. Whereas I'm a bit, like getting my own stuff ready as well. I mean, I think as long as you've got a guideline exactly what has to be done, then you tend to put your own sort of slant on some things because you find what works better for you and for your students. As you know, I use lots of mobile and apps and things like that, which are probably not regular what our uni uses, but especially in my academics, I find that that's a really great learning tool for them.
So what's your master's and PhD is not in paramedicine, right? So you're actually pushing more towards learning and teaching? Or am I
would say so, yeah. And I've got one of 3 ideas for my PhD and once for my master's. One's virtual reality, one is doing mobile learning, and the other these days is doing a lot in the development of clinical task trainers through 3D printing, really, really cheap. So sort of the example there is our podiatry students.
Okay.
A good podiatry foot with injuries and everything's around 5,000 to 6,000, and I generate ours now for about 25.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So that, yeah.
I've heard an interesting term, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to type it in the chat, which I think describes Darryl really well. Is a discipline-based education researcher. And you might have heard me say this before, right? A computer science educator, or a paramedics educator, or a nursing educator. And it's an interesting space where you're doing exactly what Sarah Jane just talked about, right? He's in the faculty, he's in paramedics, but he's a person in paramedics who's really about paramedics education. I don't know if that's an interesting sort of space, and if maybe that replaces, it then sounds like a Griffith.
So
that
that's
replaces that
interesting to me,
central learning and teaching area.
in the States, in America, if you were going to be a nursing education, right, you would get your PhD in the School of Education.
Okay. Yes, not in
Right?
the School of Nursing.
Not in the School of Nursing. If you were going to get, because one of my coworkers, she was science ed, and she did not. So she had a certain amount of her PhD classes were in science. A certain amount of her PhD classes had to be in education, and then she did her dissertation in science education. Right. And so she was what we would call like a content pedagogy person, where I was a pure ed psych versus a pure assessment versus a pure curriculum theory person. And someone that came out with that kind of realm. My wife's got a PhD in literacy. She's a pure literacy person, but even her literacy, you know, she's literacy in education opposed to literacy from the School of Linguistics, which would still have a slightly different twist on the definition of literacy from whether you came from the linguistic field or you came from the education field.
Yeah.
So these are like differences I see here, because people tend to get less so PhDs from schools because they don't have to take classes, and they get more PhDs from individuals. And so what ends up happening is you can get a PhD from an individual and you kind of define it your way. And it's the way in which that person that your supervisor defines your PhD as well, but you don't actually get any coursework at which you have been by other individuals that might be more expertise in subcategories of that field, take classes. Does that make sense? Where they would say this is, and that makes you come out holistically different. And I still struggle, because when you have a background in those areas, one of the things is, if you look at the way in which many university traditional settings develop their units, right, and historical looking at, right, it was, we have intro courses, and these are meant to be sort of nomenclature, vocabulary courses, so that students can learn an intro of what is everything in this field, not super in depth. And then as you get into your later coursework, the class numbers get lower, and now it's more interactive learning. And there was this huge debate between me and my peers at my previous institution. I taught ed psych, and somebody else had taught ed psych, right? And that person was much more of a pedagogy person than a content person than I was. And they said, you know what? I taught 3 chapters of the textbook really well, interactive teaching done really well. And I went, okay, but I taught 12 chapters of the textbook. And it was a less interactive environment, but I also knew I couldn't spend enough time on any one chapter, because like one of my chapter was assessment. That's a whole class you would take later, right? So my goal isn't to teach assessment great. It's to introduce all the terminology of assessment, have you think about it, and have some terminology so that when you take the class called assessment later, you know what it is. And so I argued, where did we help the student teaching 3 chapters really, really well, opposed to giving them 12, so that when they take those individual class units later, they're at least entry-level novel ready, with terminology and a framework to think in-depthly in the group and more teaching activities.
There you go. You're a discipline-based education researcher by stealth. You're an education educator. That's initial
Well, no,
teacher,
but
educator.
I was
teacher
in whatever
education.
course I was teaching. When
Yeah.
I taught Ed Psych, which is
Yeah.
the intro course, but when I taught philosophy of ed, it was nothing but interactive group things. It was a whole, because now I'm teaching thinking processes about an understanding of a thing in which the pedagogy is more relevant. But if they don't, in Ed Psych, I'm now, because that's what I see that's sometimes struggle, is we act like every unit can be taught every way. Not that some units need to be taught a certain way, because the way the content in the unit derives it. I gotta be honest, I've been working with trying to teach statistics, and I have never found a way to teach the amount of stuff that goes into a statistics class without reducing it and making it super pedagogically set up. It's just, there's too much stuff. So either everybody wants to go, you know what, I'm going to make a Nova be 3 classes. Because once you make a Nova be 1 class, and I got 10 times to get you in there, and you got to know how to calculate a Nova, calculate all the assumptions, calculate everything. I don't have the time to go with you and be super pedagogy with it, because it's boom, boom, boom. Like, you know what I mean? There's so much in it. And I see the same with like description of math. I worked with, Gemma Mann in her math class, and there's so much content in there. It's very hard to be super pedagogical, and that's the struggle when I prepare students for the Landtight, is I have so much content.
Yes.
Covering it all and teaching.
Well, that was the other reason I was going to say to you, you're a discipline-based education researcher because you run the Landtight. But before we, I want to throw somebody else under the bus, and he doesn't know it's coming, but I'm interested in Paul Oliveri's thoughts. I know I just switched to see if I could see him on the thing so I could see his reaction. Paul is, if I remember rightly, a discipline-based academic who is now in learning and teaching, has made the move to learning and teaching, moved into the third space, we might describe it as. Why, Paul? And tell us a little bit about the choices you made there, as much as you're willing to share.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Michael.
Yeah, I know I threw you under the bus. I knew that. Yeah.
That's okay. That's okay. So I spent, like Daryl, I had over 30 years as a paramedic as my discipline-based, as my profession. I've had about 12 years with CQ University now, from the time I first took on my first contract writing academic content, and developing up the units. What I found was, after probably like 32 years in ambulance services, teaching in ambulance services from an industry-based point of view, and coming into the higher education space, I found that by the time I'd done another 6 or 8 years in teaching at university, I was finding myself more interested by the learning and teaching aspects of how I should be doing business, rather than, and how I've changed business from that industry-based teaching to now. Because if Daryl and I would have come into the university teaching in the way in which we were taught, we would have been out in about 10 minutes, for bastardization of students, because we came in under that medical model of, where nothing was ever exactly right. And you just got pushed further and further and further and further, and in your to teach you how to become a paramedic, particularly the intensive care type paramedics. So I got, like Daryl, I was in a different way though. I was doing the using the technology and teaching focus. Because of that hybrid model that we were running in the course, and then went and did a Masters of Education, and that was in knowledge networks and digital innovation. So, yeah.
So totally finished with paramedic science now, or are you still discipline based, still focused on science, even though you're central, or it's just learning and teaching?
So learning and teaching now as a generalist. I'm no longer a registered health professional. I've given given up that registration now. So in all of my registrations, because I had a couple of health professional registrations that I was still maintaining up to that point, but now I'm firmly in the learning and teaching camp. But and if we to bring it back on the topic of that third space,
yes,
it really depends on where it depends on the organization at the moment as to what's happening within that third space, and how those folks are treated now. And I wouldn't say that we've got a particularly in tune model at the moment, because I think that we're more focused in my particular circumstances. We've got a lot more staff who are suited to educational technology and assisting educational technology than we do with the pedagogy, with the theories of learning, with the scholarship at the moment. So, and that's, whereas I can sort of do both camps. You know, I can assist somebody with curriculum development, like I've, you know, this week for me has been, or last week for me has been, assisting academics to develop a higher education, an associate degree, basically, in a new format. Assisting folks with how to teach something, and with as part of a HEP project, assisting people with video editing, and then delivering a presentation which is scholarship, which is really a scholarship based type presentation on generative artificial intelligence and how we can apply that within our courses, you know. So that's
interesting.
That's just last week. So
last question for you, Paul. Are you an academic or are you a professional staff member?
Yeah, I class myself as an academic. I'm employed as an academic still.
Okay.
Yep. So I do scholarship.
Interesting.
I do you know, I'm working on research as well with I do teams-based research, you know, with other groups. So we're looking at case studies for you know, learning and teaching, a learning and teaching grant. We're looking at problem-based learning within School of Business and Law. The other one's with Health, Medical, Applied Sciences, and there's a third one likely to come out of that as well. So in another.
Okay.
So yeah, sorry.
So comfortable in that central learning and teaching space as an academic, a comfortable academic in that central learning and teaching space. Interesting. Yep. Robert, go for it.
Yeah, I'll start first. I was going to say, like, Paul points out a really interesting point when you try to look at administrative systems, right? You have an amazing individual, right? But how do you design a role or positions based on an amazing individual? This individual learns up this theory, learns this stuff, takes in stuff well, but now we say, let's make a position like that. And what it is, it's an individual that's amazing. And then the position creates problematic, because what would we say are the qualifications that an individual for Paul, right? His position, like, so that's where I can see where, so when Paul goes to another institution or to another place or something, and then you try to refill Paul, the qualification for that position it's Paul. What are you looking for? Paul. We're looking for Paul. Well, what does Paul have? Well, Paul doesn't have this degree yet. He doesn't have that yet. He doesn't have this yet. So we want Paul. And that's where I see this gap, is how do we define the position in a way that, not if Paul's there, but if somebody else is there. And then sometimes the struggle is going back to the next thing. So I've spent a lot of time researching the flipped classroom, because when I moved to Australia, everybody talked about the flipped classroom. And when I researched it, I didn't understand what the flipped classroom was, because the flipped classroom is classrooms. Like, and this is one of the struggles with education. There's these buzzwords that are not theoretically based, right? And then they get said, so, hey, Robert, maybe you could use a flipped classroom. I go, all the classrooms, like, I've never been in a class where my professors didn't say, you need to read this outside of class and come in prepared, right? Nobody was ever like, good luck when you get here. You don't even know what happened. Yeah, that's literally the definition of every class I've ever taken since like high school. And I've been in school for a long time. And so like, and one of the things like Jason Lodge and I always struggle with, you know, when we deal with the hybrid space is this misunderstanding of learning styles and stuff. Like, I'm a visual learner. There's no research that supports that there's a difference between visual and auditory learning. We don't even know how to separate visual from auditory tasks. Like, are we going to turn your eyes off and measure if you learned really well with your ears only? Do we turn your ears off and say you learn? There are no tasks that aren't using your ears and your eyes. That's why we have these 5 senses working at the same time, but we create in a buzzword way. And then all of a sudden people start telling people you need to really aim towards audio learners, as if it is a real thing that in the learning theory it is not, because we can't fragment out and prove that anybody is anyone and anyone can separate and be part. Now, that doesn't mean people don't like to look at things more than they like to listen to things. And that doesn't mean those things either. So this is where I find, you know, this part gets hard, right? When you have a person in the third space who's just awesome, you go, that's awesome, and you love working with them, but you don't know how to define what that person has to make it a position role to ensure who comes next is their awesome.
Yeah,
I
said
sorry,
too
go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Sorry. Yeah, I agree with most of what you said there. It's that you know, and typically we tend to define it as either that person who's in curriculum, pedagogy, and design, or can assist with those aspects of it, or can assist with the technology. And at the moment, it's and it depends on those institutions, the different institutions, as to which is which. As to how they use those roles. I've just fallen into this as both because of what because of my interests and been there. So, but we've also had those. We also had not a plethora, but we had a scattering of those folks previously in our university, in the learning and teaching services, who we lost with redundancies, because they were the experienced folks who had that 30 years worth of 20 to 30 years worth of experience in higher education, and bang, we lost them in a heartbeat. You know, hundreds of years worth of organizational knowledge and experience out the window.
I was going to say, so I think what I was going to say, Paul, sort of endorses what you were going to say, because I thought, like Daryl, I thought Robert sort of saying, oh, Paul, we want Paul. It's not only Paul. I think about Danny Liu at the University of Sydney, and I think to myself, Danny's in Central Learning and Teaching, and he's great at what he does, professor, education focused in a Central Learning and Teaching unit. If Danny left and you said to Adam, his boss, who do you want to replace Danny? He'd say, I want Danny again. Right, like Danny is a very unique individual who doesn't necessarily meet those traditional academic roles, and I think we're getting to the crux of some of the challenge there, is defining that academic role as a Central Learning and Teaching person, as opposed to what we would consider a traditional academic role in a Faculty of Science or whatever it might be.
Yeah, it leads to the question of what is the rule you hire somebody in the third space. If we don't say they have to have a master's degree in this, or they have to have a PhD in this, if they don't have to have that, then what is it that you say I'm going to hire them based on? And then how do you know what they'll be able to do when you hire them, right? So whether we think I'm a good teacher or not, right? And this is the catch-22. I've been in this field for a long time. And what I tell you is I've seen people who don't publish get terminated, but I've never seen anybody who doesn't teach well get terminated. And so what that's telling you is what your job is. If this is what decides whether or not you get to stay at your job, right? And people will let you know. This is not a new adage in academia, publish or perish. Nobody ever says teach well or perish. Just never heard that phrase in my life. And so it does lead to that dilemma.
In Japan, it is. Like it's a cultural thing, because you know, in like discipline areas, publish or perish is absolutely the go. But in countries where
it's the same in the USA, you don't publish, you are out.
But there are countries where teaching is highly valued. If you look at Japan, you look at Scandinavia, these countries are very, like, they're culturally, they uphold and significantly value teaching. And in those countries, if you're not performing in teaching, you can lose your job because it's valued culturally, it's embedded into position descriptions and things.
See,
But that's a really big cultural difference to Western.
I would argue that the definition of teaching there is not the same definition of teaching you think it is. I did an exchange teaching program with teachers teaching, and and what their teaching is straight up lecture, no interaction. Even so much so that the school-based systems in Japan, the students have a classroom and the teachers move, right? So because of that, the teachers don't actually have a way to set up a plan to be interactive because it's not even their room. Like they're just showing up with a box, right? And I follow teachers around. Now, I know they might say they value teaching, but their definition of what they define teaching is astronomically different. And that I found to be, it blew my mind when I went there that it was quite that different in practice.
And it is this thing, like we've got such cultural mix in Australia that we all come from so many different positions of perspective of what something is. And I put in the chat that the EB describes the types of requirements and TECSA describes the requirements for you to teach in higher education. So TECSA requires you, if you are going to teach in higher education, you are supposed to have a qualification one step higher than the students you are teaching. That doesn't mean it happens, but that is what's described in TECSA.
Right, but it doesn't
I can see
teaching requirements. Like you don't have to have been trained in teaching, you don't have to have any teaching requirements. You have to have content requirements.
I think we're getting into discussing the academic arrogance. I do think it's interesting that publish or perish is the prevailing cultural argument, I think, still for a lot of academics. I can see that we're losing people really, really quickly, ladies and gentlemen. I did have somebody else I was going to throw under the bus, but we've run out of time. So to that person who doesn't know who they are, well done. You avoided being thrown under the bus. What I'll do is I think we've had a good discussion. I think there's still a lot more to talk about here, and I think this topic is something that needs a bit of time and a bit of thinking to unpack. But I do appreciate the discussion, ladies and gentlemen, and I saw everyone as they were going, thank you for the discussion, and thank you for the interesting discussion. It's been really interesting. More than happy to continue the discussion as we move forward, ladies and gentlemen, and see how things change. But apart from that, I'm going to wind things up because it is 1:02, and move us towards talking towards the next one. As you know, the TELCoP happens. Make us around about the end. Sure, the announcement go out. Anything you want to say to finish us off, Dr. Vanderburg?
No, just that you were kind of going in and out, and so we didn't hear you. But I think you were just telling everybody for the recording that in June should be our next TELCoP. June or July will be our next TELCoP, and with that, I think we'll wrap up and stop the recording and look to see you in the next one.
Excellent.